So now we start talking specifically about carbon materials, about the atom of carbon and so on. But in general, because our next couple of lectures are going to be more, of introductory nature, I'm going to discuss why do we need to understand carbon at all? What is the importance? So many of you who are attending this course might be from manufacturing background, engineering background. Some of you might be also from chemistry background. Many of you might be research scholars who are conducting your research in the field of carbon, and maybe you're working on one specific carbon material and not, in general on all carbon materials. So we need to understand why are we doing all this, and why is carbon? Carbon has been a very important technological material for a very long time. It's not just that we only recently started working on or started doing carbon related research. Even if you pick up a book which was written 50 years ago, it would still say carbon is a new but old material. And if you pick up a book, or a research article written very recently, it will say pretty much the same thing. So the fact is that carbon is a material which has been very interesting for scientists and for technological applications as well for a very long time. And people are still surprised when a new carbon material comes up, because it may actually have so many different properties. So it is a material which always surprises you with its wonderful properties. Now, why do we have these wonderful properties, and what are the things that we can do with these properties? So first of all, if you think about it, so the title of this slide I've given is Carbon and Life. So you know that we are all made of carbon practically. Not just carbon, but organic material, which is primarily carbon. So we are a carbon-based life form. Now, maybe there is some silicon-based life form, but let's stick to our planet. So we are in a carbon-based life form, which also means that what happens when people die, or when when animals die, or when trees die? What happens is, now this organic material, the living organic material, that converts back into carbon. What does that mean? That you lose all the non-carbon atoms from these organic materials, and then what you get is elemental carbon. What happens to these non-carbon atoms like hydrogen and nitrogen and oxygen? They either form gases, or they somehow get mixed back. They go back to the environment. So now this is obvious that a lot of things that we have on Earth are going to contain carbon, are going to have certain form of carbon in them, or they are going to yield certain form of carbon. So this material, we cannot avoid it. This is one of the very fundamental elements. Carbon is one of the fundamental elements. It's also a small element. And I'm going to tell you that you can actually, in the red giant stars, you're going to have some of these carbon atoms that are being formed, that are being generated as a result of nuclear reactions. So you have a lot of carbon on Earth, and that is why, that is number one, it is important for your anything related to understanding life, or understanding the evolution on Earth. Okay, now any organic compound, as I said, when it decomposes, it yields a certain form of carbon. It will always. So now what also happens, you know about petroleum, you know about the different forms of carbon that you mine, for example coal. So where does that come from? You know that maybe long time back there were animals, or there were trees, because of heavy tectonic movements. They might have they got buried under the crust of the earth, and because over a long time, due to high pressure and temperature and extreme conditions, they converted it to carbon. What does that mean? That again, all non-carbon atoms left those materials due to whatever extreme conditions, and then you're left with carbon. And what we also do for technological applications, we try to mimic these extreme conditions in many ways. Okay, so now these forms of carbon, which are buried under the earth, or which now have converted into not just coal, but also not just petrochemicals, but also diamonds and graphites. So one question arises is that why some carbon forms or some organic materials converted into graphite, while the others converted into diamond, and some remained coal, or some kind of, they did not completely lose all their organic material, and they then formed petrochemicals. Even within the petrochemicals, so petrochemical is a very, very vast field of study. Okay, it's you don't just have these diesel and petrol. You have many other chemicals, many other solid forms of carbon, many semi-solid forms of carbon. So you have many petrochemicals. You also have gaseous forms of carbon. So why did some organic material convert into a different form than the other? All of these materials, the carbon materials that are below the Earth's surface, these carbons are collectively known as deep carbons. So deep carbon is a completely different field of study. Why do we study deep carbon? Because this can give us some cues on how did the Earth evolve. As a planet, what was there several million years ago, and how did carbon? How did so many organic materials form? And what happened also now at several time points, various tectonic movements took place, various sudden environmental changes took place, and all of these things can be understood by understanding the structure and properties of these carbon materials. And so now you see that carbon materials, it's not just the study of carbon is not just limited to manufacturing purposes or technological applications. There are so many other things that we can understand if we know how to analyze our carbon, how to understand the properties of our carbon, or how to correlate the structure and property of carbon. Okay, now deep carbon is as I said, it's a completely different area of research, and there is one reference that I have provided here in case you're further interested. You can access this book. Okay, now how do we learn these things? As I said, you need to correlate the structure and properties of material. Now here I have one more new term, or two new terms, let's say. One is allotrope and the other is carbonaceous material. So allotropes are different, let's say, crystalline forms of carbon. We will discuss allotropes in details. We'll also discuss what should be the definition of allotrope, how this definition has changed over time, and should we include a few new carbon allotropes also, just for a better understanding. So we'll understand the allotropes are basically elemental different forms of elemental carbon, typically different physical forms or different crystal forms. Now we have these different carbon allotropes, diamond and graphite, and fullerenes. Okay, what are carbonaceous materials? Carbonaceous materials are basically materials that are that have a lot of carbon content. So primarily organic materials, we call them carbonaceous materials. But sometimes what you find, let's say in a fossil, you find a mixture of organic material, which may have come from some animal, insect, some biological, there must be some source of it, must be a biological entity. So these kind of materials, not just these kind of material, but anything that is carbon rich is known as carbonaceous material. But carbonaceous would actually mean that this is not elemental carbon. So to differentiate, we say carbonaceous materials. Okay. Now these carbonaceous materials and allotropes, when we find inside the Earth, then we can understand different biological phenomena. Okay. Now we also can study the calcium carbonates that are under the seabed. So these are also, calcium carbonate also contains certain form of carbon. There are not just carbon materials, but also other elements that people study, of course, to understand the evolution of Earth. But carbon plays a very important role because, well, again, we are all made of carbon. Okay. Now, the one good reason for the formation of these long chain, long sheet-like molecules and all these organic molecules is the fact that carbon can bond with itself. In fact, carbon really likes to bond with itself rather than with other elements. Carbon actually really prefers to make bonds with itself. That gives it a more stable geometry. And these bonds, so you can call it, sometimes I've heard the word self-polymerization, but polymer, technically we use the term when you have a monomer. Here we have just a lot of carbon atoms, and they join together. So as no matter how you want to understand it, the point is that there are a lot of carbon atoms. They prefer to form bonds with each other. Not just that they prefer to form, they prefer to form very long massive structures. So this is one ability of carbon, because of which it has become that also really helps in the formation of organic material, because a lot of organic materials are basically polymers, biopolymers. Okay, now you also have, so diamond and graphite, you also have certain curved forms of carbon. So when I say fullerenes, you already know that fullerene is or Buckminster fullerene, at least that is it's a spherical structure. But you will also hear the term fullerene sometimes for structures that are not spherical, but they have a strong curvature. So in this lecture, I'm going to use the term curved carbon in order to differentiate between Buckminster fullerenes, or any spherical fullerenes, and other fullerenes. Or when we call fullerenes, we use the term fullerenes, we are talking about spheres. And for any other curved structure, I will just use the term curved carbon. Okay, now these curved carbon forms and also certain carbonaceous materials, organic material, hydrocarbons, they have also been found outside of the earth. So I already told you that in the stars you have the formation of carbon, but outside, so sometimes when there is a meteorite that hits the surface of the earth, then you actually find carbon forms. And because this hitting of the meteorite is a very high impact phenomenon, that is why you have also sometimes these curved carbon forms. Because when you have when there is an extreme condition, extreme pressure condition, you often end up getting curved carbon forms. Their energy of formation is pretty high, but natural events can actually lead to these. So the point is that this also will help you understand life outside of the earth, within the solar system, even outside the solar system. So carbon has been found in many places outside of the solar system as well. Okay, now other properties, the properties that you use for technological applications, of course, as a material or as various forms, carbon has different properties. Each carbon material, each carbon allotrope will have a unique set of properties. However, one common thing among all of them is that these are light materials. Light because the carbon atom itself is a light material. So carbon materials tend to be light, and they typically have very strong bonding with each other, and that is why they also have good mechanical strength. Now that is a subjective thing, mechanical strength. For example, in the case of graphite, one single sheet of graphite is pretty strong, but when you have layered arrangement, then the bond between the two layers is not that strong. So you may say that, okay, this is not mechanically strong, but then again, it depends on at which scale, which length scale you're talking. If you're talking only about the single sheet, then yeah, it is a very strong material. But on the other hand, anyway, diamond as a technological material, diamond is still the hardest known material for technological applications. So we will talk about this single sheet of graphite, or what you also call graphene, that in principle is stronger than diamond, but that's not yet a technological application. Plus you have this sheet like flake like structure, so it's difficult to, for example, make cutting tools out of this material. So the point is that, however, these materials, carbon materials, are mechanically strong. They are light. If it is an elemental carbon material, it's often inert. So what is an inert material in general? That doesn't react with chemically react with things. So carbon, you would say that coals have a very good adsorbance, or they even burn, and it's certain forms of carbon may not be inert, and they may react, or they convert into carbon dioxide. Well, the point is that often when there is a conversion of carbon into other materials, carbon dioxide or any other chemicals, that is due to impurities in carbon. So good quality carbon which is prepared at very high temperature, we will discuss that later. The point is that elemental carbon materials, the stable elemental carbon materials, are actually very inert. So think about diamond, think about also graphite. Graphite, your lead of your pencil, that is actually a very stable, very inert material. You leave your pencil outside, it doesn't, in humidity conditions, or even, with if the temperature goes up and down, that doesn't really react with anything. So most of the elemental carbon materials are actually, they have an inert surface. They also have good electrochemical stability, thermal stability, and so on. All of these properties we are going to talk about, but these are some of the reasons that we study carbon. Do remember that for each carbon allotrope, the properties will slightly differ, and they will not have, sometimes they will differ also drastically, but definitely even with a small change in the manufacturing process, you will get slight differences in electrical conductivity, electrochemical stability, and so on. but there are so many interesting properties of this material, which because of which we learn about these materials. And also the fact that now I just mentioned that by changing the manufacturing process, you can actually change its properties. So this is, when it comes to manufacturing applications, then this is a very useful thing for us. So in a way, we have materials where we can tune the properties, which may not be the case with let's say certain metals or certain elements or even alloys, because you have a certain combination, you have a certain type of crystal structure, you have a certain type of material, and you may not be able to change the properties too much. But in the case of carbon, you can tune the properties using by tuning the manufacturing conditions. Okay, now yeah, carbon is an interesting material. So as I said, that it always surprises people. So there are many things about carbon that are not that are very different from other elements. So for example, carbon is conductive, electrically conductive, but not all forms of carbon. So the diamond, for example, is an insulator, and that is because of its crystal structure. When we talk about crystal structure, then we'll discuss this. But the graphitic forms of carbon, the graphite-like carbons, they are electrically conductive. It is a crystalline form of carbon, but on the other hand, you have another crystal, which is diamond, that is completely insulating. So that is because of the nature of bonding and so on. The point is that for many metals, many conductive materials, which are typically metals, for many conductors, what you have is, when you have a good crystallinity, good crystal structure, then you have a higher conductivity. Always, so as the crystallinity increases, then you get higher and higher electrical conductivity. That also happens in the case of graphitic carbons, but not in the case of diamond. So you cannot just say that just because it's a crystal, it is going to be electrically conductive. You need to understand more than that. So this is how carbon is different from many other metals. Okay, now this is about the bulk carbon materials. Also, when you think about nanoscale carbon materials, again, carbon has the ability, because of the fact that it can form these long chain sheet like molecules. It can also have basically, the carbon atoms or the rings of carbon, these hexagonal rings, which are made of 6 carbon atoms, they can withstand certain stretching and vibration, certain strain they can withstand, which also means that they can survive in a, even when they are not perfectly six-membered rings. So 7-membered rings, 5-membered rings, even sometimes what happens is, because of these non-6-membered rings, you get curved structures. That is the reason for the formation of curved carbons. That is why you also have non-6-membered rings in a fullerene, which is a football-like molecule, the Buckminster fullerene. So the point is that because of this ability of being able to form different types of bonds, carbon can also then make a lot of nanostructures. So nanostructures are nothing, we learned it in the previous lecture. Nanocrystals are nothing, they're just, or nanostructures, they are just structures that have a certain well-defined geometry at the nanoscale. So then carbon also can form a lot of nanomaterials, and that is the reason nowadays people study carbon so extensively, because nowadays we think about nanotechnology. We are trying to find applications of nanomaterials. Now we are also able to characterize the nanomaterials. We are able to understand the properties of nanomaterials, and all of these things are very easy using carbon, because carbon is actually able to form a lot of very interesting nanoscale structures, or in bulk you can call them nanomaterials. Now, which also means that when we want to understand the scientific concepts, so I told you in the previous lecture also that nanoscience basically is about understanding things at nanoscale. How do the properties of materials change at nanoscale? How do what is different when things become too small? Because classically we have only been, especially when we talk about manufacturing, so we have only been for engineers, only the bulk materials were always important. So the nanoscale. The same material at the nanoscale, it changes certain properties because of the higher surface, because of the fact that you don't have defects and so on. So that understanding these things is nanoscience. Using these applications, using these materials for technological applications is nanotechnology. And typically when we talk about this nanoscience technology, the individual structural unit should be smaller than 100 nanometers. So you will not, if there is something which is 500 nanometer in size, you will rather call it, 0.5 micrometer. Rather than rather than saying 100, it's 500 nanometer, or if it is 1000 nanometer. I mean, in principle, you can even say 10,000 nanometer, but then you don't call it nanotechnologies when you're talking about structures smaller than 100 nanometer. Now, these interesting carbon materials like the single sheet of graphite, they have certain properties which were not really observed in other materials before. So these carbon nanomaterials also provide a perfect experimental platform, for example, to physicists. So there are things that you can sort of mathematically derive. You can physically understand that what should happen when you have what kind of interactions should take place, how should the electrical conductivity change, how should the band structure change when you have a single layer thick structure. But at the same time, how do you experimentally validate it? So carbon materials, and that is why materials like graphene have become very popular also among people who are scientists and not engineers, because of the fact that they provide a very interesting experimental platform for understanding science at the nanoscale. Okay. Now this was about the life and carbon, but how about the environmental aspect? So I included these environmental aspects because you hear so much about the carbon cycle and the carbon footprint and everything related to carbon, and is that really related to also carbon based technology? So the point is that when we are living in a carbon based life form, when we have the organic fuel that we the petrochemicals, for example, they are also made of organic material, so everything is related to carbon. When you're going to burn this fuel, that is also going to release some carbon. So I told you that carbon materials or organic materials would pretty much always decompose and yield some carbon. So there is going to be some contribution of carbon in the environment. Of course, the imbalance is what is a problem, and that is why for example, when you have a lot of carbon dioxide, you don't have enough trees, then this imbalance is dangerous, and that is why all of us have indeed polluted the environment, and we have created a lot of carbon which naturally would not be there, and that is why environmental pollution has a lot to do with carbon. And that is why even for if you want to become an environmental engineer, then it is very important for you to understand carbon structures, carbon materials. Okay, so you know that carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, when these are the greenhouse gases, and there are also some other gases, for example hydrocarbon gases also, that are formed when you burn the fuel. You also have small organic molecules. So these are not, they are slightly bigger than what you have in the gases, but they are still not so small that they will just remain there in their gaseous form. Sometimes they settle down in the environment. Sometimes they're also very reactive, so they end up attaching with other molecules in the environment. Sometimes you breathe them inside and they can be harmful for you. So now where do these particles come from? When you burn an organic matter. Organic matter can be a fossil fuel. It can be also agricultural waste. It can be a lot of things. If you burn something, what happens at burning is reaction with oxygen. Okay, but if you have excess oxygen, if you have sufficient quantity of oxygen, then you will get carbon dioxide. All of the organic matter, or most of it, will convert into carbon dioxide, if not all. But if you don't have sufficient oxygen, or sometimes the burning is happening very fast, so even though there is a lot of oxygen in the environment, but because the reaction took place extremely fast, then not all the organic matter was able to convert into carbon dioxide. In that case, you will also have carbon monoxide. You will also have some tar-like particles. So these tar-like particles are basically, they result from unburnt or semi-burnt carbon particle, or organic matter, and these are then, as I said, these are heavier. So these tar-like particles, they end up forming organic aerosols. So aerosols are basically like a colloidal particle in your environment. And since these colloidal particles, which also may attract some water in the air and so on, and they will be like droplets to some extent, but small droplets which are suspended. So they are not so light that they can just go they can go too high up, but at the same time they may not immediately settle down because they are not so light. So these organic aerosols then contain the carbon, which may be either completely burnt carbon or highly burnt, so that it has relatively higher carbon content. Then you will call it black carbon. And if you have these tarry materials, then you often have brownish color because you have these oily tarry materials. So then you will have these what you know as brown carbon. So you can get the both black carbon particles and brown carbon particles, which are studied by the environmental engineers, and the concentration of these particles actually really tells you about what is the status of your the pollution in your surroundings. Okay, now because of the fact that okay, we know that these things are generated by organic materials. We also know that a lot of waste that is generated on our planet, whether it is technological waste, whether it is plastics and polymers, and or whether it is also the organic waste, a lot of it organic. By the way, organic does not always mean that it is natural. Anything which is formed by carbon, which is primarily hydrocarbon, so also the plastics and polymers, these are also organic materials. So all of these are also generated as a waste. Now, since we are talking about the environment and the brown and black carbon particles, we also should understand that if the waste material, the human waste or urban solid waste is the technical term that is used, if that can be heated in a controlled environment in such a way that we again we induce these extreme conditions when the non-carbon atoms leave. If you do it in a very controlled fashion, then you can also stop these organic the carbon particles from going into the air. You can rather catch them and then utilize them for some technological applications. So all of these things, so the carbon is definitely very strongly related to the environmental aspects, and especially environmental pollution. Okay, so now carbon in outer space. I already told you a few things about it. So carbon based materials have been found outside of the Earth. Very interestingly, this is a picture I have taken from the ISRO website. So you can go on the website and maybe read more details about it. This is a picture taken by Mangalyaan. And this picture is of one of the satellites of Mars, which is known as Phobos. And this is actually a recent picture. Just in July 2020, the Mangalyaan took this picture, and in this is the first time any color picture of Phobos was taken, by the way. And what is very interesting about it is that some carbonaceous materials were detected on Phobos. Now, what do these things tell you? If there is a presence of hydrocarbons, that means there is a possibility of life. Maybe not human life, maybe not animal, maybe some very small organisms may exist on Mars as well, or on Phobos. So this is where carbon becomes very important. So you see, just the presence of carbonaceous material can tell you so much about the evolution of a planet, and so much about the solar systems, and so many interesting things. Okay, now also in the outer space there are various complex organic materials and carbon-based molecules that exist. So in the case of red giant stars that I had mentioned previously, red giant stars are basically, they look red because they are in their late evolution phase. Okay, they contain carbon, so their environment contains carbon. And how there actually you have carbon being formed. So you have hydrogen to helium. You know that helium is formed due to nuclear fusion, and if you now have two helium atoms fusing together, the nuclear fusion, then they first they make a beryllium atom, and then after that then there is a carbon atom formed in this nuclear process. So there you see how elements are generated. So at very high energy, you have carbon atoms being generated in these red giant stars, which of course they come together and sometimes they also form structures. Often they are curved carbon structures like fullerenes. And these have been formed, has then been found in several red giant stars, or the environment surrounding the ionized, highly ionized environment surrounding the red giant stars contains C60 or similar the spherical carbon molecules. Okay, and so you know that these stars are also our source of carbon. This is where the element is being manufactured. Okay. Also, there are then certain analogues of fullerenes. Analogues means you have some other chemical, let's say, entity, any other element, for example, attached on top of them. So if you have hydrogen attached to fullerenes or hydrogen trapped inside the fullerenes, then you would call them hydrogenated fullerenes. And these are also believed to exist in many interstellar objects. So you know that carbon is definitely found in the outer space, and that it does tell us a lot about the outer space.